Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at an IGN video about apparently why Resident Evil 5 can't be remade. And without further ado, let's begin.
Evil 4's release last year, Capcom's project to remake the glory years of its survival horror series is complete. But as the game's post-credit scene suggests, the remakes aren't over. And so the big question is,
I played Resident Evil 4, the demo, and that was fantastic. I'm planning on getting it eventually. I just have a very extensive backlog, but if they're going to make a Resident Evil 5, sure, why not?
where next? The obvious answer is a remake of Resident Evil 5. But on the game's 15th anniversary, it's clear that moving forward chronologically will take Capcom's remakes into the series' weakest era, an era of gameplay and narrative decisions best left in the past. Resident Evil 5 simply can't be remade, at least not to the standards of Capcom's best work. And so the answer
I feel like it's going to be for a really dumb reason why they're saying that the game can't be remade. But you know what? Let's find out together.
is not to remake, but to rewrite.
Okay. Why would you rewrite it?
Resident Evil is a survival horror series. Not that you'd know that playing Resident Evil 5. Sure, it features a constant flow of horrific imagery, but Resident Evil 5 is an action game through and through. That's evident in its cover shooter mechanics, vehicle chases with on-rails turret sequences, and the constant rattle of a
Well, what's wrong with that? They wanted to spice up the series. They wanted to change it up, you know? They wanted, if you look at the previous iterations of the game, yeah, it's survival horror, and then every once in a while you mix up the formula, try to do something different, because if you just keep making the same thing over and over again, you kind of get stale, you get stuck in a rut. So I don't really see an issue with that.
assault rifles. Even its visual design evokes the sandy shades of modern military games that experienced mass popularity in the late 2000s. It all speaks to a series that had lost its way. Rather than reflect on the tenets that were the foundation of its experience, Resident Evil 5 looked to the contemporary gaming zeitgeist in an attempt to find a new lease of life. The result is an unholy hybrid of Resident Evil, Gears of War, and Call of Duty. It's as ugly and unwieldy as it sounds. This design appears to not just be a misguided attempt to follow Western successes, but also a misreading of its predecessor. With Resident Evil 4, director Shinji Mikami deftly reinvented the series through the use of a new over-the-shoulder camera angle. The perspective allowed for a more kinetic, action-heavy game. Despite this, Mikami never lost sight of the terror at the core of Resident Evil. Through the use of enemies that were strategically placed to provide undulating waves of tension and fear, and the inclusion of Ashley as your vulnerable charge, combat encounters were focused on surviving overwhelming horrors rather than dominating foes. Resident Evil 5, meanwhile, presents its enemies as waves to be gunned down with increasingly powerful weaponry. Their purpose is cannon fodder, a wall of meat to slow your progress through levels. And those levels are not locations to be explored. Instead, they are largely funnels that push you from entrance to exit.
The Resident Evil movies are action movies. What's the issue here? We're changing it up a little bit. I don't really like the Final Fantasy franchise. You have some that are tactic, you have some that are action, you have some that are turn-based, you have some that are like live action semi-turn-based. So what's the issue with Resident Evil 5 being a little bit more action heavy?
Resident Evil 4 may have replaced the series' traditional continuous structure with discrete levels in an attempt to move away from the backtracking-heavy design of previous games, but it preserved the spirit of locations like the Raccoon City police station. The village, Salazar's castle, and the island feature interlocking, explorable pathways that solidify these locations as authentic spaces rather than obstacle courses. Resident Evil 5 has no interest in this, with the majority of its stages being little more than corridors peppered with dead ends to hide treasures in. Their lack of authenticity means no one will ever mention the Kajuju Autonomous Zone in the same breath as the Spencer Mansion. All this is to say that a faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror games. It's telling that the series' reset point, Resident Evil 7, was a reinvention of the very first game, a haunted house that grew ever larger as you unlocked new rooms by solving its puzzles. Clever reinventions of this base conceit is the key to Resident Evil's success, be that dropping an unstoppable force into the house's corridors, such as Resident Evil 2's Mr. X, or expanding the scope of the house. Resident Evil Village's titular location is effectively a giant manor. Its corridors are streets, and its rooms are houses. Resident Evil 5's stage-driven structure is simply inferior to this design. A modern recreation of it would only further highlight its flaws, especially coming in such close proximity to master.
A remake of it would only show its flaws more. It's just a different style of game. You know, game developers are allowed to break away from their bread and butter. They're allowed to do that, you know? Like, they don't have to stick to something. As long as the game is good, as long as it's fun. I remember playing Resident Evil 5, I think on the PS3 back then. I had a blast. And, like, that's what got me into the Resident Evil franchise. Because I'm not a huge survival horror kind of person, but I played number 5. I thought it was interesting, and I went back to find out more. So I don't like. I'm still waiting for them to get to why it can't be remade. So far, this kind of feels dumb.
The classes like the remake of Resident Evil 2. Remakes can, of course, completely redefine the structure of their source material. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, is recognisably an updated version of the classic RPG, but its world design and gameplay mechanics are a world apart from the 1997 original, and so you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil most in need of a remake. A whole new environmental structure and scenario design that reins in the action and dials up the horror would bring it in line with Capcom's other remakes. But all of this doesn't account for Resident Evil 5's most notorious problem: racism.
I'm done. I'm done. Okay.
Set in a fictional West African country, Resident Evil 5's primary antagonists are black people. Yes, it's technically the Ouroboros virus that protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting, but the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of mobs and primitives who are violent even before their infection. Intentionally or not, Resident Evil 5 positions Africa as the Dark Continent, an uncivilized world harboring a diseased population that needs gunning down via Western intervention in the name of global security. This insensitive treatment of people of colour was hotly debated even as early as Resident Evil 5.
How sensitive do you think I am? Honestly, I'm from Africa, right? I'm born in Canada, but first generation. Parents came here, first generation. We don't care. I could tell you, like, I'm the N-word, right? If you say the N-word in Africa, people do not care. It means nothing to them. And also, if you go to Africa, there are still tribes there. There are still some barbaric practices. I believe it's in Nigeria. There's this tribe where a man, before he wishes to marry, he needs to get whipped. And only if he's able to withstand the pain, he's able to select his wife. If two men want the same woman, they have to whip each other. And the first one to be like, I'm done, loses. So, okay, like maybe it's an exaggeration and it's a over exaggeration of the culture, but it's not like it's coming out of nowhere. And also, it's in Africa. I feel it would be weirder to have white people as the enemy than to just have black people. It's a Resident Evil game. Like, who cares? We're fighting zombies, right? And in Resident Evil 4, you fight against a bunch of Spanish people, right? You go to the church and they're speaking Spanish and whatnot, and you shoot them, you kill them. Why is that not racist? Is it racist? Is it not racist because they're Spanish? Is that what you're saying, IGN? Can I even say that word on YouTube?
Population that needs gunning down via Western intervention in the name of global security. This insensitive treatment of people of colour was hotly debated even as early as Resident Evil 5's debut trailer, with writers such as Ngai Kroll and Stephen Totilo pointing out the game's uncomfortable post-colonial imagery. The arguments and think pieces continued well into the game's release window, with IGN's own former editor-in-chief Hilary Goldstein having also wrestled with the subject. But that was 2009, a time when race was apparently a debate rather than a reality. In the
9.3 out of 10 IGN rating. So I don't really think you guys had a very big issue. I don't think it has a very big issue with the game. It has a 9.3 rating by IGN. I'm just saying. Let's continue.
2020s, in a post-Black Lives Matter world, there is only one acceptable response to a white man shooting waves of Africans for an entire video game. No.
There is one thing I do. I have a job to do, and I'm gonna see it through.
Remakes may be able to redefine their source material, but there's only so many changes you can make until it's not a remake at all, but an entirely new game. And if you take Africa out of Resident Evil 5, is it Resident Evil 5 anymore? Even with a vastly improved, more sensitive take on the continent, perhaps one with a black protagonist and a more empathetic look at the outbreak, the experience would simply be too divorced from the original to hold the name Resident Evil 5. So where does Capcom go now? Personally, I'd look backwards. Code Veronica is an ideal candidate, as is the original Resident Evil. But if the only way is chronologically forward, then a total rewrite of what comes next is the logical path. Because what followed Resident Evil 4 was not one terrible game, but two.
Honestly, I'd be upset if they changed Resident Evil 5, because one, not a lot of games happen in Africa. Not a lot of people know anything about Africa. At least it's putting Africa in a game. At least it's putting it on the map. Sure, it's insensitive to portray black people as zombies because of a zombie outbreak. Sure, whatever. But I mean, I would love for more developers to have games set in Africa. I would love more developers to take from the history of Africa to make their games. And if you're going to be in Africa, might as well have black people in the game too. And if it's a zombie outbreak, then at the end of the day, who's going to be infected the most? Sprinkle a couple of white people in there too, because more and more people of different nations and different colors and backgrounds are living in Africa now. I saw this white man who was born in Nigeria. He's ginger with blue eyes, but he's Nigerian. Put some of those in the game, but don't make it a whole race thing, especially when you give it a 9.3. Especially when you guys give it a 9.3. But no, like first of all, we're not that sensitive, okay? We're not going to die because we're playing, I don't know what his name is, but this character in Africa. Like, I honestly believe most African people do not care about this sort of thing. Would I like to see more representation in video games? Sure. I would love to play as a black protagonist who's not an asshole. That would be fantastic. Or who's not like a villain or a gangster or a thug. But I'm not upset when I see black people in Africa being zombies. It's Africa. That's where they're made. That's where they come from.
Resident Evil 6 tripled down on the action-packed, set-piece heavy shooter design, to the extent that much of it could be mistaken for a third-person Call of Duty spin-off were it not for the monsters. Its restrictive level design practically puts you in a chokehold, forcing you to endure a barrage of bombastic moments that have no interest. Resident Evil 6 is a survival horror, only in that it's a horrible game that you have to survive playing. But this time around, it doesn't have to be like that. Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of the timeline. In Resident Evil 4 Remake's post-credit scene, evil mastermind Albert Wesker details his plans for world domination to Ada Wong. Reflected in his glasses is an image of Excella Gione and the Stairway of the Sun, two significant plot elements from Resident Evil 5, which indicates Capcom's intentions. But there's more to consider. This scene is largely a replication of the sequence from Assignment Ada, a non-canon chapter from the original Resident Evil 4. Its shift from unofficial to canon points to a willingness to change. Furthermore, the end of this scene is completely rewritten. When learning of Wesker's plans, rather than dutifully deliver the stolen Las Plagas sample to him, Ada betrays her shadowy boss and forces her helicopter to turn around. In this moment, the future of Resident Evil becomes unclear. Capcom has given itself the freedom to do whatever it wants. I just hope it's not a remake of Resident Evil 5. For more on how Capcom is altering the series,
as I said, very dumb. I hope Capcom sticks to its guns, make a great Resident Evil 5 remake, stop being sensitive. With that being said, we're gonna bring the video to a close. Are you upset that there's black people in Africa in Resident Evil 5? Let me know in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Before you leave, I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year. If you could help me with that, that would be fantastic. And if you don't want to, well, remember, at the end of the day, I'm just some guy on the internet, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.